I pulled into the parking lot that afternoon with no sense that anything unusual was about to happen, because it was one of those ordinary, forgettable days where nothing feels like it could possibly go wrong. The sky was overcast but calm. The air carried that faint smell of asphalt warming under the sun, and I had arrived nearly half an hour early for a meeting I didn't want to miss. So instead of driving aimlessly or sitting inside a crowded waiting room, I chose the most normal option imaginable, which was to park my car, turn off the engine, and check my phone while time passed. The parking lot belonged to a mid-sized shopping plaza on the edge of town, not fancy enough to draw attention and not neglected enough to feel unsafe, with a grocery store anchoring one end, a pharmacy, and a few smaller businesses lining the sides, and wide rows of parking spaces that were only half full at that hour, creating a quiet, open environment where people came and went without thinking much about who else happened to be nearby. I parked closer to the outer edge of the lot, not because I was hiding or avoiding anything, but because those spots were open and I didn't feel like weaving between cars. And once I settled in, I leaned back slightly, unlocked my phone, and began responding to messages that had stacked up throughout the day, including a text from my sister asking for confirmation about a family obligation later in the week, and an email notification reminding me about a bill that needed attention. Time moved slowly, but comfortably, the way it often does when you're half focused on a screen and half aware of the world outside. And I occasionally glanced up to watch shoppers load groceries into their trunks or push carts toward the return stalls, all of it blending into the background noise of everyday life, until I noticed something that broke the rhythm of that calm routine. At first, it was just a feeling, the sense that someone was watching me, which is something most people brush off because it usually means nothing. But when I looked up, I saw a woman standing several spaces away near a dark-colored SUV, facing directly toward my car with her body stiff and her arms crossed tightly against her chest, staring with a level of focus that immediately felt uncomfortable. She wasn't holding a phone or unloading groceries or waiting for someone, as she wasn't moving at all, which made her presence stand out against the natural motion of the parking lot. And while I initially assumed she might just be waiting for someone else, the longer I watched her, the clearer it became that her attention was fixed entirely on me. Trying not to jump to conclusions, I looked back down at my phone, reminding myself that parking lots are shared spaces, and that people look at each other all the time for reasons that have nothing to do with suspicion. But every time I glanced up again, she was still there, still watching, her expression hard and judgmental, like she had already decided that something about me didn't belong. After several minutes, she began walking toward my car, her steps slow and deliberate, not hesitant or confused, but purposeful, as though she had resolved to confront whatever she believed she was witnessing. And when she stopped next to my driver's side door, she leaned slightly forward, peering through the window with an expression that mixed irritation with authority. I lowered my window just enough to hear her clearly, because despite the tension in the air, I still assumed this might be a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a short, polite exchange. But before I could even greet her, she demanded to know what I was doing there, her tone sharp and accusatory, as if my presence required justification. I explained calmly that I had arrived early for an appointment and was just waiting while checking my phone, choosing my words carefully because I didn't want to escalate a situation that already felt unnecessary. But her reaction made it clear that my explanation didn't align with whatever narrative she had constructed in her mind. She asked how long I had been sitting there, glancing around the lot as if searching for validation. And when I told her I had been there for about 20 minutes, she shook her head and said that was far too long for someone to just sit in a car, adding that she had been watching me and that my behavior looked suspicious. I asked her, as calmly as I could, what exactly she thought was suspicious about sitting in a parked car while using a phone. But instead of answering directly, she stepped back, crossed her arms again, and said that people who loitered in parking lots were often up to no good, and that she didn't feel safe with me there. At that point, the conversation had already crossed into something more uncomfortable, because it was clear she wasn't responding to facts or logic, but to a feeling she had decided was enough to justify confrontation. And before I could say anything else, she pulled out her phone and announced that she was calling the police. The casual way she said it, as if this were a reasonable and routine response to seeing someone check their phone in a public place, sent a wave of disbelief through me. And as she spoke to the dispatcher, pacing slightly and gesturing toward my car, she described me as a man who had been sitting in a vehicle for an extended period of time, refusing to leave, and behaving in a way that made her feel threatened. I stayed where I was, hands visible, phone resting on my lap, because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong and leaving would only make the situation look worse. But the longer she talked, the more surreal the moment felt, as though ordinary reality had been replaced by an exaggerated version where normal behavior was suddenly treated as criminal. A few people passing by slowed down, their curiosity drawn by her raised voice and the word police, and I could feel the familiar discomfort of being watched and judged by strangers who had no idea what was actually happening, only that someone had decided I was a problem. When the police arrived several minutes later, their patrol car rolled into the lot quietly, lights off, and 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area with calm professionalism. But the woman immediately waved them over, pointing toward me with urgency, her posture straightening as if she felt validated simply by their presence. One officer approached her to hear her side, while the other came over to my car and asked what was going on. And I explained everything from the beginning, that I had parked legally, turned off my car, checked my phone while waiting for an appointment, and had been confronted without cause. He listened without interruption, asked for my ID, which I provided, and while he walked back to his partner, I watched the woman speak animatedly, her hands moving as she emphasized her concerns, occasionally glancing back at me with an expression that suggested she expected consequences. When the officer returned, he handed back my ID and told me plainly that I hadn't done anything wrong, that sitting in a parked car in a public lot was completely legal, and that checking a phone did not constitute suspicious behavior. The woman immediately objected, insisting that she knew what suspicious activity looked like and that the police should trust her instincts. But the officer responded calmly, explaining that feelings alone were not grounds for police action and that no law had been violated. Then, in a firmer tone, he addressed the issue of calling the police without reasonable cause, explaining that emergency resources were limited and that repeatedly calling them based on unfounded suspicions could lead to consequences, especially when it involved harassing someone who was doing nothing illegal. The confidence drained from her face as the reality of the situation set in, and for a brief moment, the parking lot was silent, the tension hanging in the air as nearby shoppers pretended not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. The officers eventually left, offering a brief apology to me for the inconvenience, and as their car pulled away, the woman stood there for a moment, clearly frustrated, before turning and walking briskly toward the grocery store without saying another word. I sat there for a while after that, longer than I had originally planned, because the encounter had left me shaken in a way that was difficult to explain, not because I feared punishment, but because of how easily someone had tried to turn an ordinary moment into a dangerous one based purely on assumption. Eventually, I started my car and drove away, but the experience stayed with me long after, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling part of daily life isn't crime or chaos, but the quiet certainty some people carry that gives them permission, in their own minds, to control who belongs in public spaces and who does not.